Hi, I'm John Hawley. I'm the winemaker, the grape grower, sometimes the chief cook and bottle washer for Hawley Winery in Dry Creek Valley. I've been making wine here in Sonoma County for a little over 30 years. Graduated from the University of California at Davis in 1980, and then I went to work for Preston Vineyards. And the next year after that, Clos du Bois hired me as their winemaker. I grew their brand up, developed their barrel fermented Chardonnay and their other wine styles, and then Kendall Jackson hired me. And I was chief winemaker for Kendall Jackson for 6 years. Well, these vines may look like kind of a mishmash looking at them. You see a lot of canes coming out in all directions, and it doesn't seem particularly organized. But in fact, there is a method to the madness, and this has all been very much planned out. As we came through and we pruned the vines when they were dormant, when the leaves had all fallen, we were thinking about how much vigor did the vine have, and how could we give them enough fruiting wood in order to produce a decent crop, and not so much that it would overtax the vine. So we can control the amount of fruiting wood because the canes bear, the last year's canes bear this year's canes, and this year's canes each have 2 clusters on them. So we can come out and we can thin these off if we think there's too much fruit on them. We can leave more canes if we think the vine has enough vigor in order to support it. But essentially, any vine or any plant has a certain amount of vigor, and it can put that vigor into growing leaves, or it can put it into growing fruit, or it can put it into both. And our job as the overseer of the vine is to try to get a balance, to try to get enough leaves for photosynthesis, to get the grapes ripe, and to leave enough fruit on it so that we're getting a decent crop. One of the questions that always comes up in the vineyard is how much crop is there going to be, and everybody always wants to know why there's more or why there's less or how much is there going to be, and it's a very difficult question for the growers to answer because there are so many factors that come into bearing on the fruitfulness. For one thing, the fruitfulness of the vine is determined when this little bud that produced this cane this year, last year when it was just developing inside this cane, it depending on what the weather was when that bud was developing, determined how fruitful, what size, that this would be a small cluster and that this would be a little bit larger. Or for instance, on this shoot, it developed a little bit later when there was more sunlight shining on it, and so the clusters are much larger than they were on the bud that developed early when it was overcast. So you can see that the weather that happens at the time that these buds were developing last year has a profound effect on what the crop is going to be this year. But it's not the only effect, because in addition to that, the weather that is taking place right now during the bloom period, you see that these flowers are right in the middle of bloom. You can see that some of the stamens are drying up and others are just popping out. But in general, only about a quarter of these flowers will actually produce a grape. The others will just dry up and fall off. But the number that actually produce grapes is quite variable from year to year, and it depends on what the weather is. We had some very hot weather last week. If these had been flowering when the weather was over 100 degrees, we could pretty much guarantee that there would be almost no grape berries on each of these clusters. They might have just 3 or 4 berries on them. It's very, very bad for a grape grower to get hot weather during bloom. Cool weather during bloom would have slowed down the flowering of the vine and made flowering take place over maybe 3 or 4 or 6 weeks period. If that happens, then we have very uneven ripeness within the cluster. We may have green berries and raisins on the same cluster. So the weather this year, as well as the weather last year, have profound effects, as well as the soil. And here we've planted our Cabernet Sauvignon in our weakest soil because it's a vine that's very vigorous. This cane just grew in about a month, and it's 3 feet long. We don't want our Cabernet to keep growing and producing lots of leaves because they'll shade out the fruit, and the fruit flavor is very much dependent on getting good sunlight exposure. Here we have actual berries, and if we compare it to some of, you see some are larger than others, but they'll all be pretty much the same size later on. But if we compare it to something like this is a flower that's just happening now. You can see the potential for the number of berries is huge, but they just won't end up being there in the final analysis. Actually, it looks like we're going to have a pretty decent crop this year, which is good. because we've been very shy on our Cabernet for the last 2 years. But I think that this year we'll have close to 3 tons per acre, which is a very comfortable amount. Certainly not a high amount by most people's standards, but I think we'll get the kind of concentration as well as that grapefruit flavor that we look for in our Cabernet.